All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Brooke Medina, Vice President of Communications at the John Locke Foundation down in North Carolina. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
So we've got a lot about great, exciting stuff to talk about, and a lot of what we talk about here on Free the Economy ends up being national or even occasionally international news topics, the big, high-profile stuff. But we also really like to go down to the state level, talk to some of our friends who work at state think tanks and advocacy groups, and see how the big national issues apply at the state level. And of course, there's stuff, whether it's, sometimes transportation, education, different things like that, where most of the action really is at the state level anyway. So we don't want to forget about the people doing that hard work in the 50 laboratories of democracy.
I always have loved that term. Sometimes I'll use test labs for liberty too. And I just think that is such a great way to capture what federalism is. And it's also obviously a good way to identify some cautionary tales or some success stories and figure out what works. And so I'm here for it. And thank you for having me on today.
Great. So can you just give us the quick intro version of what John Locke, the foundation, does, and just who is John Locke? Where do you get where'd that name come from anyway?
Yeah, so John Locke Foundation is, of course, named after John Locke, not the one from Lost, although I wouldn't be opposed to that because I did love Lost, although that Locke character was interesting. But so was the real John Locke, the philosopher. And so we have been around for 30 years. And of course, we're named after him, namely because he was a British philosopher that really challenged the notion up till then, which had not been challenged enough, which was the divine right of kings. Do monarchs, are they really appointed by God? Do they get to have complete authority and rule a nation and their people however they see fit? Or is there a rule of law, a natural law that we must appeal to? And that must govern how kings govern. And so Locke released a number of essays and then the treatise on government, um, as well as tons of political commentary, even related to the American colonies that we've borrowed. Some of it has been more mature than others. And so there's plenty of debate around Locke. But really, I would say what he gave Americans as they were shaping this new nation and the Declaration of Independence was obviously the notion that rights came from God, not from kings, but also that private property rights are critical to any sort of free society. And that begins first with the individual owning themselves, and then from there emanating out to actual land and property, and just how incredibly important that is and connected to our humanity that is. And so our think tank is named after him because we believe in private property rights for North Carolinians, as well as economic opportunity for them, including, of course, we talk about typical stuff like budget and taxes, which is at the state level. Also, though, election security, election fairness, education policy, energy policy. So we cover a number of areas, just anything that really has to do with state level issues and sometimes how they interact with the federal government.
Right. And so you've got uh a big state where there's lots going on. And like you said, all of that, all the stuff that happens, every single year, like budgets come out, as well as different election controversies and, legal controversies that come up in the state. But you also have friends and allies in other states around the country, like our friends at the State Policy Network, for example. Tell us about what sort of relationship as a state-based organization do you have to the people in other states, and how do you collaborate, or what relationship do you have?
Yeah, I think this is good because it's a good question to ask, because even though the states are the test labs for liberty, there's so much collaboration that can happen when you're ideologically aligned. You believe in the principles of liberty and limited government and rule of law. And so you work with other states to figure out, hey, what's working in your state? Whether that's an education related bill to ensure that there's academic transparency, or it's, yeah, an election type bill or simple budget and tax stuff. What sort of taxes are generating appropriate amount of revenue to justify its existence, and what isn't. And so we work with a number of state level think tanks, whether it's in Florida or West Virginia, or even further out west, like in Utah. And we collaborate with one another. One recent example, actually, of how this looks in practice is we worked with the state of Utah. Libertas Institute is the name of their think tank, or one of them. And they had rolled out a regulatory sandbox in their state, which essentially gives businesses an ability to sort of innovate and sometimes fail, sometimes really succeed without a lot of regulatory burden that you would often find in entrenched sectors. And so we looked at what they were doing, we copied it, and we made it specifically for fintech here in North Carolina. And so there's like that sort of reciprocity, where we share certain items that have been working for us on the education choice front. And that's how state level think tanks interact with one another.
See, that's great. I know every once in a while you'll see a sort of wave of policy changes that will go ripple through a bunch of states right after each other. You know, sometimes there are policies that we argue about for years or decades, and not much changes, and then sometimes fire just catches, and a lot will change at the same time. You know, so I think we've seen in the past few years probably a lot in school choice. So you have states that are adopting sort of universal vouchers and school choice, things like that, um, led in part by our old friend, now former Governor Doug Ducey in Arizona, but other governors and other legislatures around the country. And then there's another one. You go back, 15, 20 years almost, um, having to do with property rights that you mentioned. After there was a famous case up in Connecticut, I believe, of a woman getting her house taken under the color of law, using the powers of the state for economic development. And so this power of eminent domain has been it's been around for a long time, where a state government will come in and say, well, we need your house because we're going to build a freeway, or because we're going to build a sewage treatment plant or something like that. But we've seen plenty of cases where people's private property has been taken just so it can be given over to some other private business that the state or city government just decides that they want to favor for whatever reason. And so uh, after we had a big Supreme Court case about that, the Supreme Court, I think, wrongly said that affirmed that cities and localities do have the ability to take that land even when it's for economic rather than public safety reasons. We had many states all across the country passed laws saying that in our state we won't do that, even if it is constitutional, even if the Supreme Court said it's constitutional for states to do that. We had cases, dozens of states that said, no, we won't do that, and we're actually going to double down and protect property rights. And so that was sort of, to me, was an example of a kind of a silver lining case, where even though at the top level, the Supreme Court case we thought was wrongly decided and left open the possibility of abuse of property rights, there was a kind of brush fire among the states, not just all states where there was a majority of one party or the other, that came together and sort of closed that loophole for most states.
Yeah, and in North Carolina, that's certainly been actually a battle we've been having related to eminent domain. And it's something that John Locke Foundation has been focused on because of that Kelo case that certainly highlighted the valid concern that people have about entrenching private property right protections in state constitutions. And so here in North Carolina, we have been actively educating the public on the need for protections within the state constitution that would ensure that state governments cannot exercise an eminent domain for the sake of a private company, or just a non-governmental facility or anything along those lines. And Right now, we don't have those protections in our Constitution, and it's led to some really just heartbreaking stories as of late. In particular, one that we've been watching here at the John Locke Foundation, which is related to about, I would say, 24 families and entities that have had their homes, their churches, and their businesses taken away from them by the state government just this past May. It was really, really quick. They had about a month notice, and it was to create roads for this new Vietnamese electronic vehicle manufacturer called VinFast, which this is a very new company. VinFast was founded in 2017. They have not, to my knowledge, rolled out actually any cars here in the US yet. So they have some property out in California. They want to build a manufacturing facility here in North Carolina, which is just fine. But the concern really centers on the state government is taking people's land, kicking them off of it to build these facilities. And some of these folks have been in their homes for 50 to 70 years, and they haven't even had much of a heads up. I mean, like I said, about 30 days notice. And to add some insult to injury to this, like I said, it's to build a road to this new manufacturing facility of VinFast. But after all of this came to surface and people's homes were getting taken from them, VinFast informed us that they're running behind. So they're not even planning on opening when they initially said they would. And when we think about the economic conditions right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and you're betting on a brand new company that's, again, only, a few years, 6 years old, it's really problematic. And I think a lot of North Carolinians are having a hard time stomaching this, and it's for good reason. And it also highlights the need for state governments to think through eminent domain protections and ensuring that it's not used against citizens for private businesses.
That is a really important point. I should mention that the original case I was referring to was the case of Suzette Kilo, who's from New London, Connecticut. The city of New London wanted to, and unfortunately did taking her house so that a corporation could build a private development as part of it's an economic development deal, not something that in that case that was going to directly benefit the public at large. So on the one hand, you have some states that have state policies that are trying to, in their own sometimes unfortunate way, create economic development in the state, doing that in a way that, I think and some of our friends think is a little either ham-fisted and inconsiderate of the property rights of people in the state, or in the worst cases is just sort of cronyism, right, where there are payoffs and favoritism for certain economic actors and not other ones. But then on the sort of other side of it, the economic opportunity for individuals, you also have a lot of state policies that impact and in some cases restrict the ability of an individual person to work a job, to start their own tiny one-person company. What kind of experience have you guys had there with things like licenses and sort of permissions and occupational regulation?
Yeah, one that comes to mind that I think is especially relevant because it affects so many people is related to healthcare licensure and people that are licensed in another state, perhaps, and are unable to transfer that license here to North Carolina, or they're not able to practice in a telehealth capacity because of licensure requirements. Another one is, for example, nurse practitioners. I'm just going to set the stage for you here real quick, particularly as it pertains to nurse practitioners. Here in North Carolina, we have 100 counties. Out of those 100 counties, at least 98 of them, maybe all 100 now, have healthcare deserts of some sort or another. And so we're talking either mental health care, dental health care, or general practice health care. And right now, as the law stands, nurse practitioners who oftentimes have very similar and very close training to that of a medical doctor are unable to practice without the direct oversight of a medical doctor. And so we have whole counties sometimes who do not have medical doctors there, but they have nurse practitioners, and they cannot practice in those areas because of licensure challenges. And again, these women and men are able to issue prescriptions. They have to do similar reporting to the state. Again, for all intents and purposes, they operate and function like a doctor in many respects. And yet the licensure issues and our state's laws have made it increasingly difficult for them to practice, especially in rural areas where we're experiencing even more sizable healthcare shortages. And so that's one part of, like, when I think about economic opportunity, but also just even the opportunity to live and people to actually access care that prevents diseases. That's one that just touches so many people here in North Carolina. And so a law that's been introduced has been called the SAVE Act, and that's to help not only nurse practitioners, but other medical personnel be able to expand their scope of practice in a way that is consistent with the training they've already received. So I think that's a particularly important one, that as North Carolina, and I know many other states, have expanded Medicaid, for example. And so we're about to add another 600,000 at least North Carolinians onto our Medicaid rolls. And yet we have provider shortages all across the state. And so that creates not only the economic challenges for the individual who's practicing, but again, challenges for those people who are trying to access care.
I know that definitely is a big challenge. I think when you look at economic development for across the whole state, uh, we have some big trends in America where certain states are growing faster than others, certain regions are growing faster than others, and Americans are migrating from state to state and region to region. That's always been true. Americans have always been moved around to consider a considerable degree, probably more than in most countries. But in the past several years, I think we've seen an especially lopsided flow of people from states like New York, California, Illinois, into places like Texas, Florida, Arizona, and it seems like every few weeks there's some new
And here.
analysis, right? Yeah, and North Carolina, of where people are moving to and moving from, and it's hard not to notice certain characteristics of those places where mostly it is blue states that are losing population, and mostly it's red states that are gaining population, and that's those are broad categories, but certain things are consistent with that usually. Taxes are usually higher in blue states, and taxes are usually lower in red states. And certain other restrictions and regulations are usually tighter or heavier or more burdensome in the states where people are leaving. It's not just weather, it's not just cost of living, although sometimes that's it too. So given that all of this is going on and the trend seems to be going mostly in one direction, what are the sort of, like, threats and opportunities for a state like North Carolina that's in the category of one where a lot of people are moving into rather than moving out of?
Yeah, that's a fun question to think about, because I'm really excited. I mean, North Carolina, in particular, Raleigh and Charlotte, are some of the fastest growing cities in the US. Raleigh had the hottest housing market according to US News for 2022. And then we were also voted by CNBC as the best state to do business in. And so North Carolina is, again, reflective of like a Texas and a Florida, where it's these Sunbelt states that people are drawn to. Of course, yes, climate is an important part of that. But yeah, I would not diminish the fact that, to your point, the things you said related to cost of living, tax environment, affordable housing, education opportunities, strong workforces. I mean, here at where I live in Raleigh, we have the Research Triangle Park, which houses a number of universities just in this whole surrounding area. So we've got NC State, we have UNC Chapel Hill, we have Duke University, all within like a 30-mile radius of one another. And so just thinking in terms of unemployment numbers, which we have lower unemployment numbers than the nation at large. And these are all attractive reasons to move to these states. But again, there is that challenge in terms of how does this change our demography, particularly when I'm thinking in terms of the electorate, so this voting public who oftentimes are so accustomed to regulations if they're coming from a very blue state. And so they might not bat an eye at certain regulations that we, if we're used to a more liberty-rich environment, would have an issue with. And so I think one of the challenges or opportunities is to educate those voters who are moving here and assimilate them into these concepts of very limited government at the state level, holding those governments accountable, whether it's municipally or at the state level. And so I look forward to that. And I think that's part of the fun of working at a state level think tank, especially in communications like the department that I'm in, is engaging with the general public, informing them of what's already going on, what's at stake, and looking at examples from a California or a New York and issuing some cautionary tales, while also helping them be a part of the story of making North Carolina better, because you get to interact with these voters easier than you would at a federal level job.
Yeah, I know. Reminds me of when I was at the Tax Foundation and also hosting the tax policy podcast over there quite a few years ago. But we would often do research and publish studies that had 50 state, or if you include DC, 51 states, so to speak, of data, and we would rank them all. And so we would have for all these different categories, whether it's how high your property taxes, or who has the highest income, state income taxes, or things like the business climate as seen through tax policy, all that sort of stuff. And we would rank who is the highest and who is the lowest, and then we just stand back and watch the states fight over it, because one things that we noticed is that state legislators and state politicians would often cite that data and say, either very positively saying, look, just like you said, the US News and World Report said we were great on this, and CNBC said we're great on that, and you might have said the Tax Foundation says we're great on this other thing, and state policymakers really do use that a lot. We found back then, and still I know today. So, or obviously the flip side of this is, look, we're the 47th in the nation in XYZ thing. We got to fix our deal here. Are there specific states that you have seen, looking from the perspective from North Carolina out, saying, we really got to copy what these people are doing. We're really behind, and we gotta do it the Arizona way, or the Nebraska way, or whatever, or they're states, nearby states maybe, where you're like, oh, don't let us become like East Virginia, or whatever.
East Virginia. Yeah, so you took the words right out of my mouth in terms of Arizona. I think that's a great one, especially as they are leading the charge on the school choice front. It is beautiful to see. I say that as a parent and also just as a citizen. It is beautiful to see when parents have more opportunities to choose the education format and location that best suits their kids' needs. And I know I'm preaching to the choir on that front. So I would say that's certainly something that we've been watching here in North Carolina. And as I mentioned, Libertas and what they've been doing at Utah on the regulatory sandbox front has been great. And then when you think in terms of cautionary tales, thinking about Illinois and the need for pension reform and accountability, government transparency, making sure that elected officials are actually held accountable for the way in which they exercise authority over people's tax dollars. And then in New York, when I'm looking at housing, we've been doing a lot of work on the housing front. And when I say affordable housing, I don't mean like government subsidized housing, but just increasing the supply, making sure we're doing some important zoning reforms. I look at New York and just think about all of the issues they have, but not even just with the rent controls that they have instituted, but some of the crime issues that they've had, which again is something that a lot of people, if they get a choice of where they want to live, they're certainly going to choose somewhere safer as opposed to more dangerous. And so those are a few examples that come to mind. Another state that seems to be doing some great things on the school choice front is West Virginia. So I'm encouraged by that. And then on the energy front, just stuff that Texas is doing, been watching that a lot. Here in North Carolina, we have nuclear power plants as well as natural gas facilities. And our desire is also to lead the way on this front, especially in a very purple state as North Carolina, where you have these intense battle lines when it comes to climate debates and whether or not we need to go the renewables route with wind and solar, or another green route, which would be nuclear energy and some natural gas added to that mix. And so again, to that point that we talked about earlier with states being the test labs for liberty, it's been fun to watch other states succeed. It's also been, heartbreaking to watch certain states fail, because you don't want them to fail, because that means their citizens are hurting. But it's also provided us some important lessons learned.
Nice. Now, this is something we started to do on the show to give people a chance to think big, and we've looked at a lot. We've mentioned a lot of different topics here today, but because you guys know the specific policy challenges in North Carolina better than the rest of us who are outside of here. If I could give you a magic wand for a minute, it's pretty sparkly, so I hope you're ready for that.
Perfect. That's what I wanted.
The magic policy wand, and you could wave it, and you could have 3 policy wishes, things that you would change in the state. What kind of stuff would you say? You know what? I'm going to use one of my wishes on this thing. It's really important.
Oh man, 3. I get 3. This is great. And I didn't even need like a genie in a bottle. I get a wand. It's a sparkly one. So I would say the first one is related to, because North Carolina is growing so fast, like we even gained a congressional district this last go around. It would be zoning reforms. I think that's critical, because if someone doesn't have a place to live, and I know this just as a military family, living in hotels for 6 weeks at a time, being priced out of neighborhoods, I think zoning reform is critical to ensuring that people can live where they work and be able to afford rent. That is such an essential, critical area of people just being able to have happy, fulfilling lives. And so zoning reform, making sure that the housing supply is adequate. Second one would certainly be energy security and reliability and affordability. Again, that's a part of this crazy weather in our country, and you have some really hot summers and some really cold winters, and so making sure people can afford their electric bills through making sure that we have like nuclear and natural gas. That would be my next one. And then my third one, I'm going to say this as a mom, definitely education, universal ESAs. I want a universal ESA, so to my shame, I have not mentioned anything on the tax front, but I feel like North Carolina is doing pretty darn good on that front. Mm-hmm. And so those are my top 3 wishes, and I'm waving my wand. Let it be so.
All right. Excellent. I think those are great wishes to make, but we're not just making wishes here. We're doing the hard work of policy advocacy every day to make them come true.
Hear, hear, Richard. That's a good way to put it. And that's actually what I love my job. And I love getting to be so close to these policy conversations and debates, because I look at policy as how I love my neighbor politically, and just thinking about the fact that there are men and women and children in our state who they deserve to have these good opportunities to be able to fulfill the American dream as they define it and see fit. And they're worth that. And so it is so much fun to be able to work in this space. And I'm just grateful for that opportunity.
Oh, great. Well, that is heartwarming. We love to end on a positive note. Before we go, tell all of our listeners where they can find you and find John Locke Foundation and all your great stuff online.
Yeah. So, of course, johnlocke.org. You can learn about John Locke, the man, the myth, the legend, as well as all of the work we're doing in the state to advance economic opportunity. And then you can find me on Twitter. That's my bailiwick. That's my domain. I have a lot of fun there. So I'm at Brooke_Medina_. And you can also keep up though with North Carolina news at carolinajournal.com. That's our newspaper.
All right, fantastic. Well, Brooke, thank you so much for being with us. And we will keep up with all the North Carolina news. I think I will probably be going to your website to pull some great examples of good policy work for future episodes.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. It was a delight.
All right.